Hello, welcome to another week of Big Picture Monday. I want to welcome everyone who's new here. I've had a lot of new people discover these videos lately, whether you're on YouTube or Instagram or even Facebook viewing these. So welcome. I'm so glad that the word's getting out about how helpful these are, especially I know a lot of you are Sunday school teachers, and I think this can really kind of help ground you in what is actually going on. And then it's easier to dive into all those little spiritual lessons as you're teaching when you feel like you actually understand the story of what's happening. Of course, even just for personal scripture study, I find this invaluable to know what is going on, and then I can get into the little lessons. And that's what I try and do with you each week here, is just tell you the story. Tell you the story of what's happening, and then you can study. You can use the prompts in the Come Follow Me manual. You can use my Instagram posts. You can use the stuff in my study guides. Whatever you need in order to listen to the Spirit and pull those lessons out. I find it a little easier when you actually get the story of what's happening. This week we're studying 2 Kings chapters 2 through 7. So we are now in the book of 2 Kings. Remember that the 4 books of 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, and 2 Kings, they all kind of blend together as one big story about Israel turning to kings. We started off learning about Samuel, who then anointed Saul and David. We learned about Solomon. And now last week we talked about the super important history part you need to know is that all of Israel split into 2 kingdoms. We have a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom now. Hopefully you remember that. Go watch last week's video if you want to get a quick recap on that. But that is important to know because last week we stayed in the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom is called Israel. Confusing, I know. We've got Israel, the southern kingdom called Judah. So in the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, last week we talked about the very wicked king Ahab, his wife Jezebel. We talked about the prophet Elijah. And at the very end of our reading, we learned that Elijah was asked to find Elisha and that they would serve together for a while. Now, we actually didn't skip very many chapters between the end of 1 Kings there and where we're picking up in the book of 2 Kings. But what you do need to know is Elijah prophesied that wicked King Ahab and his wife Jezebel would have very gruesome deaths. And wicked King Ahab's came true. So Ahab has died. His son took over, but he only ruled for a couple years. So we're actually going to talk about this guy's brother. So this is still Ahab's son, but it's just his brother that took over, the brother of the previous king that took over, and his name is Jehoram. So he is the new king of the northern kingdom of Israel. He's not wicked. I mean, he's not righteous either. He's pretty wicked. He's not as wicked as King Ahab. King Ahab was renowned for his wickedness, and Jehoram didn't quite hit that. And we'll see this week how he did work with prophets a little bit. But just to kind of set the scene, that's where we're at. We're in the northern kingdom. King Jehoram is the king of the land. The southern kingdom, we're not talking about them again this week. Sorry, southern kingdom. But just to let you know, they are considered a little bit more righteous at this point. They are still listening to prophets and having appropriate temple worship and everything like that. So southern kingdom, at least at first, is at this point in time is considered a little bit more righteous. Okay, so let's start with our actual reading. 2 Kings chapter 2, where we start our story this week. We're actually at the end of Elijah's life. We're at the end of his ministry, and he takes Elisha. Elisha has been his little disciple, and we know that they served together for a few years, although we don't get too many records of what they did together, but I imagine that had to have been a pretty cool experience learning from the prophet Elijah. But Elijah knows his time is up, and so he goes with Elisha. And it also talks about a group called the Sons of the Prophets. Just to fill you in on who they are, it pretty much just means a group of prophets. And remember, when we say, if I said right now, the prophet, you know who I'm talking about, right? Everyone knows who I'm talking about. But in all reality, being a prophet means someone who says a prophecy that comes true. And that is a gift that is available for many people. So this is a group of prophets who seemed to be following Elijah around and are interested to see in what's going to happen here. So Elijah with Elisha and the rest of the sons of the prophets, they go to the Jordan River, and Elijah parts the Jordan River, and only Elijah and Elisha cross through on the dry ground. The rest of the prophets stay on the other side. And on that other side, Elijah is translated. He is taken up into heaven in chariots of fire. We know from modern revelation that Elijah holds the keys of the sealing power. He holds the keys of the sealing power of the priesthood, and we know that he had to be translated because he had to come back at Christ's time for the Mount of Transfiguration, and he had to come back to Joseph Smith at the Kirtland Temple and restore the keys of the sealing power of the priesthood. So Elijah is taken up into heaven, and as he does so, his coat, aka his mantle, falls upon Elisha. And that, of course, gives meaning to our modern phrase that we use of seeing the mantle fall upon someone. In this case, it very literally happened, and Elisha then and there became the new prophet for all of Israel. So then Elisha comes back to the Jordan River, which is now flowing, and he now parts the river. Elisha parts the river to get back to the other prophets. And this is very symbolic. I don't know if you remember, back when we transitioned from Moses being a prophet to Joshua being the prophet, right as they were ready to enter the promised land, this same thing happened in that Moses died, or Moses was translated, and Joshua became the new prophet, and then he parted the Jordan River. And this was like a huge sign and testimony builder to the rest of the Israelites that like, oh, Joshua is the new prophet. So same thing happens here. Everyone knew Elijah was the prophet, but now Elisha gets to show that as well, that he has the power of God and that he has that mantle that Elijah has. And that's kind of how we start off. So now Elisha is the prophet for all of Israel. Now in chapter 3, we have some political issues going on, right? So King Jehoram, king of the northern kingdom of Israel, not super righteous, but his dad, King Ahab, who of course was really wicked, had this agreement with the king of the Moabites. Okay, Moab was separate from Israel. Okay, separate group of people, not Israelites at all. And when King Ahab died, King Moab started taking advantage of that. The king of Moab was like, I'm not going to agree to everything we agreed to beforehand. And so now the new King Jehoram is like, we're gonna have to go to battle against Moab because they're not doing what our agreement was. So he actually reaches out to the king of the southern kingdom, the king of Judah, for help. And so the king of Judah comes, and also another land, the king of Edom, he reaches out to him. So these kings are meeting together, and you can clearly see that the kingdom of Judah is a little more righteous because the king of Judah is like, well, if we're going to battle, have we consulted a prophet yet? And I can just picture King Jehoram being like, oh, yeah, we consult prophets, sure. Elisha, I've heard of that guy. So they bring Elisha to their kind of planning meeting to get his blessing, to get the guidance of the Lord as they go into battle. And Elisha prophesies that they will have enough water for their battle. Their animals will have enough water. It'll all work out. And it happens just as Elisha says, and the Israelites are able to defeat the Moabites. Everything is all good with that. Okay, in chapter 4, we start to see a whole bunch of miracles that Elisha performs. This is actually kind of his signature thing, is that when we talk about Elisha, we just see like miracle after miracle after miracle. We don't get much of his teachings and his prophecies or whatever. We just get a lot of miracles, which is fantastic. So in chapter 4, let's see. Oh, he multiplies oil for a widow so that she can then sell the oil so that she has enough money to pay off her debts so that she can keep her family together. There's another miracle where he meets a woman and she shows great hospitality to him. And then he finds out that she can't have children. And so he blesses her that she will have a child. She does have a child. She's so happy. And then later, the child dies. And she actually goes, she takes the initiative and she goes to find Elisha to be like, you gave me this child and then the child dies. Like, what is going on? And Elisha decides to send one of his disciples, one of his servants who's working with him, named Gehazi. And he says, Gehazi, why don't you go and try, and figure this out? So Gehazi goes back with this woman, and he is not able to raise the son from the dead. And so Elisha then comes, and he is able to raise the son from the dead, and everything is fantastic with that. We know that he turns poisonous food into edible food. He multiplies bread. He does a lot of stuff, okay? Lots of little miracles in chapter 4 there. Okay, chapter 5. This is one of the most famous scriptures, and I absolutely love it. Like, famous stories in the scriptures here. We get to learn about a man named Naaman. Now, Naaman lived in Syria. Syria is a totally different land than Israel, okay? Totally different. It's actually very far to the east of Israel if you're looking at a map. And so Syria is way over here. And Naaman was a really important man in the government there in Syria. And at one point, the Syrians had conquered part of Israel and had taken a bunch of people captive. And some way or another, they had a little servant maid who was an Israelite. She had been captured at some point and had been taken with them to Syria. And she was now a maid to Naaman's wife. And Naaman had leprosy. He had leprosy. And one day, while the little servant girl was serving Naaman's wife, she said, "Oh, I wish there was a prophet in the land, because Naaman could go find the prophet. Prophets can solve anything, can heal anything." And with this small and simple testimony, Naaman said, "Oh, that's what I should do. I'm going to go to Israel. I'm going to go over to Israel because I know that's where they have prophets. I'm going to find a prophet and I will be healed." So he takes a group of servants. He goes to Israel. He goes to the Israelite king, King Jehoram, and he's like, "All right, I'm here to be healed." And Jehoram's pretty much like, "I'm not the guy you're looking for. You want a prophet." And Elisha hears about this. And so he sends his servant to Naaman and says, "Okay, Naaman, you need to go wash in the Jordan River 7 times. That's how you're going to be healed." Now, this was not what Naaman wanted to hear. First of all, Elisha didn't come out to meet him. He sent his servant to go talk to Naaman. So he was very personally offended by that, because Naaman was a very important man politically and socially. And then second of all, the Jordan River is not a clean river. That is not a place where people would just go to bathe for fun, if you were a member of higher society. And so Naaman didn't want to go into the Jordan River and bathe 7 times. So he's kind of like, "All right, guess this didn't work. See you later." And some of his servants stop him and say, "Naaman, you've got to listen to this prophet. You've got to try it." And so Naaman does it. He is healed from his leprosy. Afterwards, Naaman does go back to the prophet Elisha, and he says, "Thank you so much. I have a whole bunch of money and gifts and riches that I want to give to you as a thank you." And Elisha's like, No, we don't do that here. Don't worry about it. You're welcome. See you later." So Naaman starts on his journey back. Now, Gehazi, remember Gehazi? He was that same servant of Elisha's who went to try and raise the child who had died previously but was unsuccessful. Gehazi follows after Naaman and is like, "Naaman, hold on. Elisha changed his mind. Actually, he would love some riches and some gifts if you don't mind." And Naaman's like, "Sure, of course, here you go." Gehazi thought that he could hide that from Elisha, but when he gets back home, Elisha calls him in and says, "Listen, I know what you did." And in return, Gehazi himself is then struck with leprosy. All right, chapter 6, we learn about some more miracles here. Elisha was able to cause a sunken axe to float, that the sons of the prophets were building something with. And then we get to the Syrians. The Syrians are in the land and they are about ready to attack. And Elisha receives information from the Lord about this. And so he goes to the prophet, to the King Jehoram, and is like, "Listen, the Syrians are about to attack. This is not going to be good." And pretty much the Syrians realize that Elisha is like getting all this inside information. He's better than any informant that they've ever seen before, because the Lord is the one informing him. They know every move that the Syrian army is going to make before they even make it. And so the Syrian king is like, we've got to take out Elisha because this is not going to go too well. And at one point, they see the Syrian army surrounding them. They're coming. They know that this battle is going to be imminent and it's going to be brutal. And Elisha is able to bear testimony that those that are with him are more than those that are against them. He knows that they have chariots and angels with them, even if they aren't physically there in person. A beautiful testimony. And Elisha is able to get the king to escape. And basically, they end up in the city of Samaria, kind of barricaded by the Syrian army. Remember, Samaria is the capital city of this new northern kingdom of Israel. So Samaria is the capital city. They're in there. They're barricaded. And things don't turn out too well, because now there's like a drought. There's a drought in the city because the Syrians have completely cut off all the supplies coming in and out of Samaria. Everyone in there is just stuck with what they have, and it's getting less and less every single day. It's getting very, very severe, in fact. And in chapter 7, things are getting so dire. And Elisha the prophet, he's there with them in Samaria, and he prophesies, this famine will end by tomorrow. And everyone's kind of like, by tomorrow? Really? Okay, let's see how this goes. Now, meanwhile, there's a group of lepers there in Samaria, people who have leprosy, and they are so hungry. They're starving. There's nothing else for them to eat. There's nowhere else for them to even get food. They get so desperate that they're like, listen, we're going to die of hunger anyways. Might as well die of hunger, might as well die trying to approach the Syrian army that's camped around us and begging for food. We might as well try, because we're going to die either way at this point. So they leave Samaria and they go out to where the Syrian troops are, ready to just ask for food. Maybe they'll kill us. Maybe we'll die of hunger. Let's see what happens. They're that desperate. Now, at this point, the Lord causes the Syrian army to hear what sounds like tons and tons of chariots and horses racing towards them. And at the same time, they all freak out and they just run. They leave everything there and they just run. And so when the lepers get to where the Syrian troops should be camped, they see all these campsites filled with tons of provisions and food and horses and anything they could possibly need, with not a single soul in sight. So they start taking everything that they can, and at one point they're like, we should probably go tell our king that the Syrian army is gone. So they go back to the Israelite king and tell him what's happened. They do a little test to see, is this a trap by the Syrian army? Were they just tricking us to draw us out or whatever? But they find out, no, the Syrians literally have left everything behind, and everyone out of Samaria is able to go out and finally get some new food and provisions and everything that the Syrian army had been holding off against them. That's where we end this week. All right. It's pretty cool. I love learning about the prophet Elisha. He's amazing. All these miracles that he performs. I mean, that's where you're going to find those little spiritual golden nuggets. So go read about all those beautiful miracles. It's really cool to read about, just one after the other. And I feel like even though we don't get Elisha's teachings, it's pretty easy to see what his priorities were and the spirit and the power that he had based off the miracles that he performed. I think my spiritual focus question for this week is going to be, I love the story of Naaman. That is just so powerful. But I want to think about, why didn't Naaman want to listen to the prophet Elisha's advice? Why was he so opposed to the advice that a prophet of God gave him? To me, it comes down to two things, right? It was the pride of not wanting to wash in the River Jordan. That was beneath him. The thing that the prophet said was way beneath him. And also being offended that the prophet wouldn't personally come and speak to him. And I think there's a lot to learn about, am I listening to my prophet's counsel? Am I doing what Naaman's doing unintentionally? And how can I be a little more devoted by also showing my devotion to a prophet of God? Interesting things to think about. Okay, have a great week this week studying the prophet Elisha. I'd love to hear what you're learning. Go ahead and drop that in the comments below. And as always, thank you so much for sharing these videos, especially on social media or on YouTube, subscribing, liking, adding comments, sharing to your stories. All that stuff helps more than you could possibly know. And also getting these videos out to people who might find it useful to get what is happening in 2 Kings chapters 2-7. Without too much extra fuss. All right, hope you have a great week this week. Happy 4th of July for those of you in the United States, and happy studying.